Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's installment of the Trenchless Technology webinar series. My name is Mike Kesdy, and I'm the managing editor of Trenchless Technology and Trenchless Technology Canada magazines. I'm pleased to moderate today's webinar, Trenchless Perspectives Live, Infrastructure Funding and Trenchless Technologies. We're going to take a quick poll, so please submit your answer and then click the blue Return to Presentation button to return to this screen. I'd like to take this time to remind everyone that any views or opinions presented in this webinar are solely those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent those of Benjamin Media, Inc., the publisher of Trenchless Technology magazine, nor does Benjamin Media endorse any products or methods presented. If you'd like to expand your view, click on the arrows in the lower right of the video box to enter full screen mode. Today's panel discussion looks at the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the American Rescue Plan Act. We'll look at the impact of those acts on the underground infrastructure construction industry and delve into how system owners can position projects to take advantage of this funding. Joining us today are Wayne Hoffman, the Client Funding Director of Wade Trim, a civil engineering and community master planning firm serving 9 states. In his role, Wayne helps clients target and secure funding for infrastructure projects, as well as evaluate economic and demographic trends. Leading Wade Trim's Funding Scout services, he helps clients identify funding sources and strategize and execute strategies to position projects and capital programs for federal, state, and other funding. With a background that includes engineering, community planning, construction management, and project finance, he brings insight, resources, and relationships together to solve complex problems and fulfill community needs. Also joining us is Zach Conti, Principal of Government Affairs Solutions. Zach is also Nuka National's Vice President of Government Affairs. He is a graduate of the College of William & Mary and the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Zach has worked on infrastructure contracting and labor issues since 2016, and since joining Nuka in 2019, has helped establish the organization as a strong presence on Capitol Hill. Prior to joining Nuka, he worked at the Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University. Since Trenchless Perspectives Live webinars are live panel discussions, we want this to be an interactive session. So we encourage attendees to participate by typing their questions into the designated panel in the left-hand portion of your screen. We'll try to get those questions answered during today's discussion. So just getting right into this, it's easy to get lost in the various acronyms floating around when it comes to infrastructure funding. Can you briefly discuss ARPA, IIJA, and BIL? Wayne, we'll go to you first with this answer.
Sure, and you're exactly right, Mike. It can be very confusing. If you are familiar with government work, there's an acronym for everything. So I'm going to start with the infrastructure bill. I call it the infrastructure bill. I don't call it the bipartisan whatever. I call it the infrastructure bill because it's a big pile of money. Infrastructure Week finally happened, and we got the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also called the IIJA, but I call it the infrastructure bill. But we can't forget that we also passed the American Rescue Plan Act in 2020 or early 2021 that people call ARPA, but there was a lot of money in that could be used for water and sewer. And while the infrastructure bill actually was on par with the money we spent in the 80s on a lot of wastewater systems, pollution control systems across the United States, ARPA puts it over the top. So I'm going to call the American Rescue Plan Act ARPA. With all the funding that local communities and states are putting into it, that's what makes the funding this time around unprecedented compared to the 80s. And if you remember, for those of you who were around 10 years ago, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that was a little tiny molehill compared to today. So the thing you got to realize is this is unprecedented spending on water and sewer. I think we're feeling the heat in the industry trying to design it, build it, and spend it. And there actually might be more coming. The Inflation Reduction Act does have some provisions that do apply to our sector as well. So for those of you who wanted a little break, tough, it's not coming.
Great, thanks. Zach, do you have anything additional that you'd like to add to that response?
Yeah, so just to kind of jump in here a little bit, Wayne is absolutely right. Washington has a lot of acronyms around this bill. During this conversation, you'll probably hear me refer to it mostly as IIJA or the infrastructure bill. I'll kind of use the two terms interchangeably. But within the legislation as well, there are a lot of other different programs that go by their own acronyms. So you may hear me later on talk about the BEAD program. That is the broadband, that is the large $42.5 billion broadband program that is being run through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. That is one of many programs within this bill that also have their own separate acronyms. So, we'll try to, as we bring those up, just to clarify what everything is. But if we don't, and there's something that, folks want to hear more about, do just let us know through one of the questions, and we'll try to clarify it.
Great, thanks. So that covers the acronym portion of the bills. So why don't we hit an overview? So Wayne, can you kind of give us your quick synopsis of where infrastructure funding for underground infrastructure specifically stands?
Yeah, so it really hasn't been hitting projects until just recently. It takes time for the funding to actually get to the states. Most of the funding is through the State Revolving Loan Fund program, both on the drinking water and the clean water side. A lot of that goes through existing agencies. So it wasn't creating new programs per se. It was going to flow through, the existing agencies who have been doing this for about 20 years. So a couple things, I know we're going to talk about BABA, Buy American, Build American. I can never get which one goes first right. But some of those might not be hitting your projects yet because some of the money hasn't actually hit yet. A lot of states have tried to segregate the new money that triggers the BABA provisions from the money that they've had in the revolving loan funds for a long time. So I know it adds some complexity, but it's really important that what source you're getting your funding from. Is it from this new pile of money? Is it from the old pile of money? How is your state dealing with that? Another thing to consider is there's all these ARPA funds that states have put. I'm sitting up here in Michigan who put over $1 billion of their ARPA funding into water and sewer. Really powerful stuff. It's really going to help get a lot of projects done. The key to understand there is that's got to be spent by 2026. So we're trying to get projects design planned in line for funding. A lot of that needs to go into fiscal year 2024. So it's obligated, has to be obligated by the end of 2024. So there's a big rush on that. One thing that is kind of a bugaboo for me is, when Congress created the infrastructure bill, they didn't just put this big pile of money. We keep hearing the number $50 billion for water and sewer into appropriated. About 1/3 of that is an annual appropriation that's appropriated every year. So, if Congress doesn't reach that full authorization, that number gets smaller. And in 2022, we saw exactly that. A lot of that money went towards earmarks, which have their place in getting projects done, but it also dilutes the ability of state agencies to use that money to affect their own policies. And beyond that, about $1.5 billion was left out of the authorization in the infrastructure bill. So, we got to keep trying to get that funding put in there by Congress. The good thing about this SRF funding is it doesn't need to be spent by 2026, so we can kind of stretch things out. And as I'll talk about a little later, I have some ideas on how we can help, especially communities that don't have their affairs in order, understand what's below their ground and pipes and sewers.
Great, thanks. Same question to you, Zach. Can you give us your synopsis from your perspective on where things stand? You're muted, Zach.
When we look at the funding right now, the money really is just starting to come up. We've had about one fiscal year come out so far with the funding. Some of that money hits the market earlier than others. Some of that money needs to be spent by the end of the 5-year period over which most of this bill runs. Some of that money is just out there until it's done. It really does vary on a program to program basis. The trick is when you're looking at this piece of legislation, sorry, folks, technical difficulties here. I apologize. So the trick is when you're looking at this piece of legislation, you really do kind of need to break it up into the various different baskets, right? When you look at this legislation as a whole, it is the largest ever federal investment in a lot of NUCA's key markets. It's about $550 billion in new spending over the 1.1 or so trillion in total. And it's the most funding that some of these industries have really ever seen. For instance, this is the largest single federal investment in broadband pretty much ever. There's over $40 billion for broadband construction, but that also is on just a small subset of the overall spending. There's another $25 billion for various other programs in here. There's over $110 billion for surface transportation, $73 billion for electric grid. I'm not going to go down and read every single bullet point here, but the magnitude of these dollars that are either in the system or in many cases still working their way through the system is pretty intense. And what Wayne said earlier, I think, is generally, I think, one of the better aspects of this legislation. While in many instances Congress did create some new programs here, a lot of this money is just working through those same channels that folks already know and are used to. It still is going to take time for a lot of that money to work its way through, especially because for some of these programs, the agencies were given quite a bit of flexibility in how they were going to administer that money. Of course, with that also comes some political decisions that the administration has made about how some money that I'll get to in a bit. Now, one thing that I do want to point out here, so we talk about $50 billion, $55 billion for water programs. That money is really spread out into a lot of different buckets. So when we look at the money that's administered by the EPA, most of that is going to the state revolving funds, with the clean water and drinking water state revolving funds both getting a decent chunk of money. And then a sizable amount of money on top of that allocated specifically for lead service line replacement, PFAS cleanup as well. But then you have all of these other smaller programs that the EPA is administering within this bill. Some of that money in there is directly water related. Some of these other things like clean school buses is money from other parts of the program, other parts of the legislation that they were also allocated. But you can see that the agencies really have a lot on their plate right now when it comes to administering the money. One thing I do want to highlight here when we talk about how this funding is broken out, I like to bring up the broadband programs kind of as an example of how many different things the agencies have on their plate right now. So when you look at this slide here, you should be seeing is broadband funding by program contained within IIJA. You can see there's a lot there. There's over $64 billion, right? And it's administered by a number of different agencies. The FCC has some money. The Rural Utility Service has some money. And then the National Telecommunications and Information Administration under the Department of Commerce has really the bulk of the funding contained within this bill. And you can see, as I mentioned earlier, most of that money is not subject to 5 years. The only thing that runs through fiscal year 26 is the Middle Mile Grant Program, which is only $1 billion. For the bulk of the rest of this funding, it is out there until it's expended. And most of this money is appropriated and authorized. It's in the hands of the agencies waiting to be distributed to the states. Now, part of the reason I like to spotlight broadband is because, unfortunately, this is actually one of the slowest instances of this money getting out to the market. In order for, and I'm going to focus on that broadband equity access and deployment, or BEAD program here, because that is the lion's share. That's $40+ billion worth of funding. That money can be used for broadband construction, mapping, workforce development, primarily construction, but really anything that goes into that process of broadband deployment. That is where that money is coming from. Now, the stated goal of the administration is using that funding, as well as other funding avenues that are out there already right now, that almost every American should have access to broadband by the year 2030. And we're defining broadband here as internet speeds with the standard of 100 down, 20 up megabits per second, or Mbps. That is slower, I think, than a lot of folks in the industry would have liked to see, but it is a substantial step up from previous standards. In order to find out who doesn't have broadband, so you can deploy that money, of course, we're waiting on the FCC to finish their mapping programs. And they supposedly already finished that first round of mapping data collection and should be ready to unveil really their full list of results pretty much any day now. The problem is, one, they're already behind schedule with that, and two, the maps that they are going to release are bad. They are not accurate. We already know that for a number of reasons. One, the agencies have already pretty much suggested so themselves, that they're not really happy with the quality of what they have. But two, we've worked with a number of municipalities and communities around the country who have run their own collection on what's underground in their area, who has service, who doesn't have service. And they know that the data that the FCC has for their areas is going to be lacking. It's going to be showing some areas that have better speeds that they don't, and they're probably going to be missing some of the areas that really just don't have access to anything at all. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the FCC, they may be putting, they may put out their stuff, but NTIA has already come out and said that they are not going to base any of their funding decisions off that first map. They're going to wait for it to go through the challenge process and then come out once that second or even potentially third round of mapping has been released. That is when they will determine the allocation that every state will receive from the BEAD program, which means that the earliest time that money might hit the market is end of next year, end of 2023, possibly 2024. We're frankly not particularly optimistic that money will get out the door anytime soon. So while that funding, once it's released, is subject to a much longer time frame, it needs that time frame because it's not going to be something that we see substantial progress on by fiscal year 25 or 26.
Great, thanks. And both of your responses kind of delve into the next question that I had about just how well is the process of allocating, funds going. As you mentioned, some of the funds are allocated across the states by a formula. Others, require state and local governments to apply for the various funding. So how well is the process going? Yes, what are some of the biggest hurdles to administering the IIJA funds? Go ahead, Zach. You can jump in on this one.
So there are really a number of different issues here. First of all, I really think one of them is simply the scale. On the administrative side, I think both at the state and local level, as well as the national level, folks really weren't prepared for the volume of funding that was coming out. The federal government, much like the private sector, is having trouble hiring. Pretty much everyone is right now. There are a lot of open positions for grant coordinators, for broadband coordinators, for transportation coordinators, all throughout the structure. And they've needed time to staff up and to get people to administer this money. Of course, I already mentioned the broadband side of things. That's another area where the process needs time to play out. But I think when you look at some of the difficulties at administering the funds, some of those, I have to say, have probably been created by the administration. I'll talk about this a little more later, but when we move into the implementation and oversight phase of IIJA, one of the issues really has been wrestling between the administration and its priorities and then the intent of Congress when they passed what really ended up being a bipartisan, fairly clean bill in terms of a lot of political debates. When you talk about things like labor issues or a lot of these materials issues, a lot of what Congress passed was really, frankly, missing a lot of the stuff that the Biden administration has now come in and tried to attach to the funding. So that is, I think, one of the things that is holding up certain projects as well right now.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And I think the big key is that these programs have been around for a while, so we're good at administering them. I mean, it's flowing through the same kind of mechanisms. The issue is the velocity is a lot higher. So there's a lot more to administer. In the last 2 years, we've had a lot of turnover at a lot of these agencies, which is a challenge. I was working with a grant program manager who had been with the agency for a whole 3 months and out of college in 1 year. It was a really struggle to work with him. But, I think it gives us an opportunity to help those folks along the process. They were trying to, interpret the rules that they were given by political appointees and such. So, it is a challenge with that. We're seeing a lot of states modify some of how they've been doing it. So for example, Ohio wouldn't make grants to communities that were above 10,000 in population. They've recently changed that. So your disadvantaged communities that are in the mid-size range are now eligible for grants and principal forgiveness. In Florida, it's actually state law that it only goes to smaller communities under 10,000. So you're seeing each state kind of handle it a little differently. But, the mechanisms are there. I think the issue is people. And we've been talking about that in this industry for the last 3 years. And I don't think that's anytime soon.
Great, thanks. So we did have a question come in here. So the initial announcement of the Infrastructure Act, there was talk of about $100 billion set aside for culvert rehabilitation. Tenny would like to know if that made it into the final authorization, and if so, what agency will administer those funds?
So yeah, it wasn't $100 billion. I think that particular program, and there are 3 different programs that cover culverts. 2 of them relate to fish passage. So that's trying to get fish from one water body to another. That's going to be your smaller culverts, especially in smaller streams and creeks. But there is a larger one that's through the DOT. Yep. So the U.S. DOT has a culvert replacement program. I believe that NOFO went out earlier this year. That program is out. The other ones that are, and maybe Zach knows more, they're smaller. I think one is through NOAA, so the National Oceanic Administration Agency. That one is fish passage. So if you got to show that fish are passing through your culvert to access that funding.
Yeah. So there are really the 2 to talk about. There's $2 billion for fish passage specific, over $2 billion for fish passage specific culverts. But then there's $1 billion in general for the National Culvert Removal, Replacement, and Restoration Fund. And that is the one that is being administered under DOT. The funding announcement for that, applications opened, I want to say in October for that. So just take a look. That should still be out there. And as I said, or as Wayne said, rather, yeah, fish passage certainly would help your odds on a lot of those culverts.
So this question is specifically for Wayne, and kind of covers that aspect of going out for this funding. As an engineering and consulting firm, like Wade Trim, what role do you have in this process? How do you work with your clients to help them secure funding?
Well, I think, and this is general of all consulting and engineering firms, I mean, we help identify the problems that need solving and then come up with solutions, so the contractors can do their thing in the field. I think what our firm does a little differently than most is we look far in advance before the program exists to get intimately familiar with the budgets and the legislation and know where it's going. You need that lead time before the grant application or the period where you put in project plans comes out to have your ducks in a row. So, we're always trying to get ahead of the programs, understand what's changing, so that we can convey that, when it's time to put in the project plans The timelines to put those in are getting shorter and shorter here in Michigan. They moved up the deadline significantly, so we're under the gun here in Michigan to get our project plans done for clean water SRF and drinking water SRF. But if you're able to see that coming, it's a lot easier. One thing I'm seeing, and this is general, and one thing I'm hoping that we can use some of the funding that was in the infrastructure bill for is help communities that have technical inequities. So there are many communities that either don't have the resources to hire consultants to do that upfront planning, identify the problems. They don't have the staff with the know-how to do it. If we don't invest in that, those communities are going to be left out. And that's really inconsistent with the Justice 40 initiatives of the administration. So if we don't invest in that and find ways to provide the technical assistance to those communities that are disadvantaged, I fear they're going to be left out.
Yeah, and I know this is a question for Wayne, but I am going to jump in there because one of the things that I do want to highlight about the infrastructure bill is the volume of money that is set aside specifically for small and disadvantaged communities. And I think it's really important to have folks like Wayne, but also for, frankly, contractors to step up and help with this as well. Those communities don't necessarily have people to help them gain access to those programs. There's money out there, but they may need help accessing it.
Great. Well, it kind of dovetails nicely into the next questions I had here. NUCA is a contractor-focused organization. So, as a contractor, why is it important that I stay abreast of I'm not a contractor, but I'm just doing this in the viewpoint of a contractor. Why is it important that I stay abreast of the various funding avenues? Because it's really my clients that are going for this funding, not me personally.
Well, I mean, lots of different reasons. One of which is it does help you position your business for knowing, where's the business going to be coming from in the next few years. Knowing, for instance, that there is substantial money available for lead pipe replacement right now, I mean, that presents an opportunity for contractors who want to get involved in that sort of work. Likewise, if you're ever considering getting into the broadband market, now is really the time, simply because, frankly, a lot of broadband contractors already had more work than they could handle just on the private side. Now you're seeing $42.5 billion in federal construction funding coming on top of that. Right. So the sheer volume of work that's out there, assuming you can get materials and labor, and of course, that is a monumental assumption, the volume of work out there is enormous. And so those are two things that I think that are very much important. The last additional thing, though, of course, as I kind of just mentioned, is you can help your potential customers. A lot of these, in particular, smaller communities, they don't have someone on staff who goes and looks for these funding opportunities. But you can take some time and kind of point them to some of these resources for money that they might be eligible for and bring some of these projects to those communities. A couple of the resources that I frequently like to point to as a good starting point for contractors, on build.gov, the administration has a couple of handbooks to the infrastructure bill. They're very long. There's, I think, one of them that's 400 pages. The other is pretty similar. They're featured very prominently on that website. And really what they are is guidebooks to all of the different grant programs that are within that legislation. There are a lot of them. And just taking a look, flipping through that, you can see, some of them are specifically for rural communities, small communities, tribal communities, urban communities in some instances. You can see as you flip through that, the number of different things that, some of these communities in your area might be eligible for, and you can flag those for potential customers. Have you taken a look at this? This notice of funding opportunity just came out. Just kind of stay informed about where this money is coming from, and some of that business may eventually work its way back to you.
Great. As a reminder to our attendees, feel free to enter any questions you may have for Zach and Wayne in the question box, and we will try to get those answered during this hour session. So, one of the questions I had, are there certain restrictions on what these various funding sources can be used for? For example, as both of you mentioned, there's a large allocation for lead pipe replacement. can a system owner use funds to purchase equipment to replace the pipe, or how can they go about using those funds? Go ahead, Wayne. You can start with this one.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it done before. I know on the sewer side, I've known communities that, and I think the trick is it needs to be part of a larger capital project. So you just can't buy a piece of equipment just to have it. It has to be part of an initiative or a program. On the sewer side, I've seen communities buy sewer trucks and sweeper trucks and vac trucks with SRF. So you could probably do that. I think some communities, the question is, should we, or should we leave this to the contractors to do it? I know some communities that do it themselves with their own forces, which can be efficient and it can be inefficient. So I think that's a good question to ask. I will say this, there are pots of money for lead service lines and PFAS, but I don't necessarily consider those like restricted funds because those are really additive. So those are in addition to all this additional money that we've gotten through SRF. And, at the end of the day, this funding is going to pay for a lot of contractor equipment. So really look at your the equipment you have and your equipment needs in the future, because the amount of work, and Zach really put a point on it, all this stuff is coming. So you need to be prepared to staff up and have the systems in place to do the work. So.
Yeah, I mean, it really varies program to program. That's kind of part of the nature of the beast, right? Every different federal program has got its own set of rules and guidelines. I'm going to use the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to use that as kind of an example here. They have a restriction in their funding requirements that only 2% of project funds can be used for cost of the administration of the eligible entity grant. So you can only spend 2% of that money on general operating expenses, various things that we would understand as administrative costs, right? But then programmatic costs, they would define as broadband deployment, equity and adoption programs like providing low-cost devices to some of the people that would be served, mapping and data collection, installing Wi-Fi in multi-tenant buildings. Depending on what your project is defined as that you've received your grant for, you can see that within that program, there's a lot of different things that can be used for beyond just putting fiber in the ground. That's the bulk of the program, but it's not the only way that that money can be spent. So some of the programs have a lot more wiggle room than others. It really just truly depend on what specifically you're looking at.
It stands to reason that with this influx of funding, it equals to more work. So how can the trenchless industry specifically position itself to take advantage of this work that's coming? Zach, we'll start with you on that one.
So that's an excellent question. I mean, there is going to be a lot of need for trenchless work in the next couple of years. And I think that, continuing to push the adoption of the technology is a great time to do that. There are still folks who aren't using it who probably should be. This is an opportunity to sell them on the merits. I have to say that, with all of the broadband work coming, I know that I've seen a whole lot of neat stuff in action happening there. I think that that's going to be a big part of the conversation over the next decade or so, because the demand for high-speed broadband is only going to increase. That's one area that I like to spotlight a lot when I talk about IIJA, because as crazy as it sounds, $40+ billion in federal investment for broadband, plus money that's being used from all of the other pre-existing programs and ARPA, may not be the end. Congress still has an appetite to pour more money on this issue. I mean, the goal of having every American connected to high-speed broadband by 2030 it's an ambitious one, and it's probably not going to happen realistically. The fact that this money isn't going to be out there for another year or so is kind of indicative of that, right? But the fact of the matter is, when they have this continued emphasis on it, they've set this lofty goal. they're going to try to pour more money at the problem. They're going to try to just, I mean, that's what Congress likes to do. They set their minds to something and then they just throw money at it. I mean, that's what happens sometimes. We've done this with broadband in this country before, where we've spent a lot of money and it hasn't gotten us to the goal that we've wanted. And so we've come back and we spent more money on it. Now, the current new programs that are created by IIJA have a lot of safeguards in there to make sure that doesn't necessarily happen again. But I do think that we're going to continue to see robust federal investment towards this, which means that the trenchless share of that market is going to continue to grow. So that's just one example, I think, of one way you can continue to position yourselves to take advantage of this funding.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I'd add a few things to that. I don't think, we're always trying to be, if you're a business owner, you're trying to be more efficient in your process. I think we're going to have no choice in the next decade to be more efficient with staff and how we're doing things. You're not going to have a choice. It's going to be essential to survival, because otherwise you're just not going to be able to keep up with what's out there. As far as, each company, especially if you're a contractor, I think one of the tricks is going to be understanding, what are the technical resources that are out there to get things planned. I know one of the big issues, especially with the smaller communities, and a lot of this broadband is going to rural areas, is they don't even have the first understanding of, who needs broadband, where is it going, how do I do a survey? So trying to find the technical resources to help your potential clients understand what their needs are and what the solutions are, you're going to have to take a much, much stronger role in that. So I'd encourage you to do that. I think those who do will have an edge.
Yeah, and just to kind of, piggyback off of that myself, a lot of, I think, the workforce challenges that we're seeing, those aren't going to go away for a while. And so I think that contractors do need to be asking themselves at all steps of the process, what can I do to be more efficient with my workforce? I know that, for instance, some folks, continuing to talk about broadband deployment, when they're working on aerial fiber that's riding along on, a power line, for instance, in some of these rural communities, they're training their fiber operators to also work on those live lines. So they don't need two crews to be able to do that. If folks are qualified and able to handle both the live wire as well as the fiber installation, that's another crew that they can free up to go work somewhere else. And so when you're looking at all of these different opportunities to be more efficient, I think contractors should ask themselves, where does increasing my use of trenchless get me to that point? Because we're not going to be in a position anytime soon where you can just walk out and, hire two crews in a week. That's not going to happen anytime soon. And so anything you can do with that new mindset to make your business more efficient, folks need to be considering.
Great. So, Zach, you were talking about these large, fiber projects that are, going to be coming up. So, if you create finances for these large fiber projects, what about the finances for the pre-construction, parts of it, like damage prevention, line locating? Who's going to pay for that work to be done? Is that included in this funding?
So some of that some of that can be included within the BEAD program and whatnot. I do think that in the next year, there is going to be more of a focus in Congress discussing damage prevention. There's certainly a lot of things that we would like to see fixed about the process. We certainly think that, there's, I think, a lot more attention that Congress could give towards funding, proper locating, and figuring out, how to make that a more central point of the construction process. It's worth noting that the PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration reauthorization bill is set. It expires, I believe, in 23. It's set to be debated during this Congress. That is traditionally a venue in which a lot of damage prevention priorities are discussed. And I think that we'll see Congress start to pay a little more attention to some of these issues when that bill does come up. I know that NUCA is going to have some things that we're going to want to see included in that legislation, and we'll likely, try to insert ourselves into that debate pretty early on in the drafting process to try to get some of these changes done.
Great. Wayne, do you have any insight on this?
Nope, I think Zach covered it.
Good deal. You know, obviously, we kind of talked about how the trenchless industry can position itself to take advantage of this work, with the funding coming down. What are some of the roadblocks for the construction industry in terms of taking advantage of this work? We're talking about things like lack of labor, supply chain, or, we've heard from some people that, there's just some potential unrealistic deadlines with some of this. So can we kind of cover that aspect? You can go ahead and start, Wayne.
Yeah, I think a lot of the folks on the call probably already are feeling these. Labor obviously is a big one. My thing with labor is, it is a demographic force. It's not something that we can flip a policy switch and fix. Birth rate has been dropping precipitously over the decades. And we've also lost the tailwinds of immigration that we had in the late 80s and 90s. So those are things that, you don't change overnight. It takes a while to raise a kid and put them into the workforce. The hard fact is those folks aren't there. So like I said, by necessity, we're going to need to embrace innovation, embrace technology, and trying to do more with less. One other piece that is really important is, these unrealistic deadlines that some folks have. If you are going to use this funding, you really got to think, am I going to be able to get this done in time? Give your folks a little more time, understand your supply chain a little better. I mean, we're talking about Buy America, Build America. You better know where things are coming from, how it gets to you. Those are things that, in the engineering and construction industry, were not really thought about. I mean, we did think about them, but not as much as we're going to have to. I went to a conference a couple weeks ago, and I was just curious. I walked around all the supplier and the material vendor booths, and I saw one booth that said Made in America. I was surprised. I was expecting to see a lot more Made in America. Hey, our stuff is sourced from so-and-so, and you can say it's Buy America, Build American certified. Know where your stuff's coming from. If you're a supplier, if you make equipment, figure out where it is. And if that's something that you can say, this is a certified American-made product, our steel's coming from here, put it on there, because we're going to be looking for you very, very soon.
Yeah. So, we talk about unrealistic deadlines. The thing that concerns me the most, frankly, beyond workforce, beyond supply chain issues, and I know that sounds crazy. A lot of you are already thinking, what concerns you more than both of those in construction right now? It's permitting timelines. Because with the way that our federal permits are set up right now, the clock may run out on a lot of projects simply because how long it takes for them to move through the system right now. The average time for a NEPA reform, just for instance, but the average time for a NEPA permitting approval on a project right now is 4.5 years, which is well beyond the scope of most of the money that remains that's funded by IIJA. That's just one example of a federal permit. Right, so 4.5 years. You're not possibly going to be able to take advantage of most of the funding that is included in the infrastructure bill without some sort of permitting reform. And we've heard a lot about that over the last couple of months. Senator Joe Manchin was promised during the debate over the Inflation Reduction Act some sort of vote on permitting reform. He has still not gotten that, largely due to opposition from House Democrats. But that's something that folks in Washington are talking more and more about, because that was not an issue, I think, that most people really thought about during the negotiations and the passage of IIJA. The Biden White House has now come out in favor of Manchin's proposal several times now. You have House Republicans who are talking in the new Congress about taking, frankly, things even a step further on permitting reform than a lot of what Manchin has proposed. Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia introduced her own permitting reform language around the same time that Manchin introduced his about a month or so ago. That's, I think, more in line with what House Republicans are looking at pursuing. But I think that's going to be a pretty robust debate early on in the next Congress. Folks want to take advantage of this money, but if the government never gives them the permits, you're not going to be able to build it. Beyond that, as I said a little earlier, the Biden administration really has kind of gotten in its own way on a couple of things. I think we've talked about some of the problems with Buy America, the way that that's been implemented. And I'll let Wayne talk about that a little more in a second. But one of the things that really does concern me is this expectation from the administration that this supply chain is just going to spring up overnight when they really want to accelerate the timeline and putting this program into place rather than giving the American manufacturers time to adapt to the increased demand. And then the other thing, real briefly, going back to the permitting conversation before we move away from that, is programs like One Federal Decision, which is something that would essentially just streamline the approval process, was a Republican priority included in the bill. Biden didn't like it from the moment he took office. In fact, Trump had passed an executive order on that Biden almost immediately rescinded when he took office. That made it into the bill. It's signed into law. And ever since then, the Biden administration has basically been ignoring One Federal Decision altogether. So that's kind of another example of the administration just kind of getting in its own way. But let's steer things back to Build America, Buy America, because I do think that's important to talk about.
Yeah. So I saw a question. What is Made America, Buy America, Build America? So the American Iron and Steel regulations have been in place for about 12, 13 years, ever since the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So that is a requirement that iron and steel used in EPA funded projects, many other projects, is made in America. The difference with the requirements now is that manufactured components must have a certain percentage, and going up to full components over a period of years. So that obviously opens up a really big can of worms of different types of things in the supply chain that must be built or made in America. As Zach said, it's really tough to make that work. It sounds like a great policy idea, but you don't build a plant for a flange that's only built in Holland in the United States in less than 6 months. That's where we're at right now, where we're going to be held to the BABA. I'll call them BABA just so I don't screw up the words. We're going to be held to the BABA requirements on EPA funded projects, which is basically all water and sewer projects. I'm not sure if maybe Zach, do you know, on the broadband side, has that been determined yet? It's going agency by agency.
Yeah, that's one of the issues that we're really still looking at. I know that there are still some debates over what even to classify fiber optic cable as, because one of the issues that we've run into is, you have things like the optic glass that's considered to be a construction material, but you never just use that by itself, right? It's wrapped up into the broader cable, which is a manufactured product. So which standard does it fall under is one of those debates that's been kind of going back and forth between the agencies. We're expecting to see a lot of stuff published on that very soon. The issue that we have is that a lot of the general waivers did expire last month, but now you have these smaller but still pretty broad waivers that are working their way through the rules process. We're generally speaking at NUCA supporting those. It's not that we don't support American manufacturers. It's really we want to give our manufacturers time to cope with and set up the processes to make these things in the country. But really, we just need clarity from the administration on what exactly is subject to these requirements and what isn't. The last thing that we want is for either a contractor to be penalized because they weren't in compliance despite their best effort, or a major project is held up because this one widget that's only manufactured abroad, which is essential to the project, is just not available from an American supplier, and there's no waiver around it. So it's taking some time for that to wind its way through the federal rulemaking apparatus, but that is another thing that is starting to slow down projects.
Mm-hmm. Not only is it starting to slow down projects, but it's really frustrating contractors. I've talked to quite a few. One was a pretty large scale contractor that, has he was asking me, what should we do? And I was like, I don't know. What are you going to do? And he's like, we're just not going to bid these jobs, which is absolutely not what we want to hear right now. We want to keep these projects moving because it's going to keep coming. So, one delay here, is just going to create a cascade.
And that's one of the things that we've made very clear to the administration is that for certain markets, if they attach too many strings, requirements, political priorities to some of these jobs, people just aren't going to bid them. Broadband in particular is really one that I know I keep coming back to it, but it's worth noting, a lot of these broadband contractors had so much private work before ARPA and IIJA, frankly, that they were able to just turn down jobs. And frankly, with workforce and material shortages, they have to turn down jobs. And so one of the things we've made clear to the administration is if you put, for example, if you put project labor agreements on some of these things, if you put, attach too many other strings to the jobs, they're just not going to bid them. And the project's just not going to get built.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And Zach mentioned, this a little bit in his response about the BABAs on the broadband side with the waivers. Wayne, can you discuss the waiver process, I guess on the sewer and water, the EPA side of things? Because I believe there's some waivers attached to the SRF as well, correct?
Yeah, so that guidance just came out, and I haven't gotten completely intimately familiar with it yet, but basically there's a checklist of justifications you need to make, and essentially you're trying to say the BABA requirements is not, putting the BABA requirements on this project is not in the public interest. And there's a series of ways to make that justification. I'm sure there's a couple of lawyers out there trying to figure out what the best cases to make are. I think over time we're going to get really cute in terms of how we address that. But you're probably going to see some solutions coming out for that in short order. The thing that, in addition to what Zach said, what concerns me is I'm seeing different agencies put out different types of waivers, different types of processes. So, it's another language that everyone's going to have to learn. I just saw HUD put out a waiver on, and it's a little more flexible than EPA's, that certain thresholds. So if it's a project under $250,000, it's automatically waived. That kind of thinking would be great for EPA. It doesn't help the larger projects, which quite frankly, larger projects have a lot more components, and they're a lot harder to figure out, where things are coming from. But we need some flexibility, especially in the short term, because these things are not going to happen overnight. Our knowledge of these processes is not going to evolve overnight, and it is going to hurt project progress. So,
as we're discussing the waivers, and probably it might, I'm not sure, who can apply for them? Is it the project owner, or can manufacturers apply for the waivers?
Excellent
Who does that
question.
fall on?
So the guidance says that it is the owner who is responsible to submit it. Now that means that the owner is probably going to turn to you, the contractor, the designer, and say, "Help me out here." So I think a lot of that is going to fall on the shoulders of the contractors to help them figure that out. So be prepared for that. But what it says in the guidance, it is the owner who's responsible. So they're doing the submitting. But it is definitely one more thing that you have to jump over on your way to completing a project.
Do you have anything to add to that, Zach?
No, I think Wayne pretty much summed it up there. I mean, he's right. It's another potential way, though, that contractors can help out the owners of these jobs. But it's another thing you've got to learn how to juggle.
So, when we're talking about all of these, various financial streams that are coming in, is it, are there definitive timeframes to use them, and then what happens? Do they just kind of disappear? Is it a use or lose situation?
That's a good question. So it does vary by program. So I'll stick with the SRF example. So it does vary by state. Sometimes you can get on a list and be on that list until you're ready to fund. Sometimes you got to wait until you're on the fundable range because they'll rank projects. For instance, in Michigan here, typically in a typical year, we're getting $200-300 million worth of projects that were submitted each year. This year, we have $2 billion in projects submitted across the state revolving loan funds. So that's going to far exceed the amount of money we have this year. So you could be on that list for a while before you're in the fundable range. So for some projects or programs like that, you can submit your application. You might be on that list for a while before you're fundable. But you also have to show progress towards a capital project. So that's just one example. The one that everyone needs to know is the American Rescue Plan Act funds. So if you're working with a program, and the American Rescue Plan Act funded a lot of different grant programs, especially at the state level. So you really need to know, is that applicable to my job? Because that is an ironclad rule. You don't have that done by New Year's Eve on 2026. That money goes away. So that's a really hard rule that you need to know. I know that, it's really complicated. Where does this money come from? Find out. If you can't find out, find somebody who can help you there. Yours truly can do that. But there's also other folks in the industry who can do that as well. And one last thing, there's a lot of, like I mentioned, there's a lot of turnover in the agencies. Little patience goes a long way. At the end of the day, these folks at the agencies want to spend the money right. They want to make sure that you're spending the money right. They want to make sure they're spending the money right. So treat them as an ally. Maybe you won't end up as an ally at the end, but treat them as an ally because they want to, have successful projects at the end of the day too. So hopefully we can have a good relationship through these tough times.
Anything you'd like to add, Zach?
Well, the one thing I do like to, this is kind of a segue for what I tell a lot of my contractor members, but, speaking of treating these folks at the agencies as an ally, treat your member of Congress as an ally as well. If you're having trouble with a particular job, Congress does work for you. Send them a note, spotlight some of the issues that maybe are happening with getting a job approved, permitting timelines are tied up, you don't have a waiver for a product you really need. These are things that folks in DC and at the agencies need to hear because that's what helps us fix these problems from the lobbyist perspective in Washington. Another thing that frankly I find really valuable while we're on the subject is invite them to come out and see these jobs and explain to them the problems that you're having. So do treat those folks as allies as well, not just in helping you navigate the process, but frankly in helping them understand where the process really is at. That's, going back, I will say that while a lot of this funding, does dry up in a few years, it really does vary program to program. In many respects, even if we're just talking about the broadband money, we're still going to be seeing IIJA funding rolling into the market all the way through the rest of the decade. So this is stuff that we need to wrap our heads around and really, really get to know well, because we're going to be dealing with it for quite some time.
Great. Well, we're approaching 3 o'clock here, so I think now is as good a time as any to wrap it up. So I'd like to thank Wayne and Zach for providing valuable insight today. We had some great questions, and I appreciate you for taking the time, both of you for taking the time today to answer those. I'd also like to thank all of the attendees for joining us today. I want to remind everybody to be on the lookout for information on future Trenchless Perspectives live webinars from Trenchless Technology Magazine. We have them planned quarterly in 2023. So thank you again to all the attendees for joining us today. Thanks again to Wayne and Zach. This concludes today's Trenchless Technology webinar. If there's something you missed or would like to reference, today's webinar will be archived at trenchlesstechnology.com/webinars. As a reminder, any views or opinions presented in today's webinar are solely those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent those of Benjamin Media Inc., nor does Benjamin Media Inc. endorse any products or methods presented. Thank you again, everybody, and have a happy holiday season. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.